Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman, for another schmooze, informative conversation.
No, definitely not a schmooze.
So for a very focused conversation on one particular topic. Today is Friday, May 2nd. Lazar, we are going to talk about the hostage release / prisoner release negotiations that have been ongoing, of course, since the beginning of the war and the October 7th Hamas onslaught, which saw some 251 hostages taken back to Gaza. But we're going to start looking at the sources. Lazar, thank you so much for taking the time to do the research and to look into the Jewish tradition for any kind of sources that we may have to lay the foundation to our conversation that we're having today about the hostages.
Yeah, let me just preface the entire discussion with a statement that there's clearly no easy decisions on this issue. It's clearly an issue that is a very fraught and important strategic issue and social issue right now in Israel. And it's not a new thing. If you look at Israeli history, it has been an issue that repeats itself. It's been a very live debate and a very loaded discussion. And if you go back through Jewish history, it's also been an important and painful reality of Jewish existence and of the discussion around this issue. So as you noted, it's not only a strategic issue, but it's also a strategic issue. It's also an emotional issue, a moral issue, and even a religious issue. Now, if we're talking about hostages, there's no explicit mention in the Torah of how we're supposed to deal with this idea of Jewish hostages from our own people. This comes about later. And I think it's important to note that there seems to be a contrast being drawn between Jewish ethics and the dominant ethic at the time, which is Roman ethic, which actually had this idea that if someone is taken away from Roman land to enemy territory, he basically stops being a legal free person in Roman mind, and it basically kind of disappears from the legal framework. He's no longer a father. He's no longer a landowner. He basically disappears, and there's not this legal obligation to free him. Of course, in Jewish and in parentheses also later Christian ethics, there is this important ethic and this important imperative to free hostages. Maybe most famously, Maimonides, a famous doctor, philosopher, rabbi, teacher, writing in the Mishna Torah, talks about the redemption of captives, so this hostage issue, taking precedence over sustaining and clothing the poor. And he says you don't find any mitzvah greater than redeeming hostages. He says captivity as a hostage is like famine, drought, exposure, and danger to one's life. So this is something as important as can be. And he also ties it to Torah imperatives. He talks about do not harden your heart from helping the poor in Deuteronomy. Do not stand by when someone's life is in danger. Do not subjugate someone with hard work. And then he also points at some positive commandments as well. So for Maimonides, it's very clear that he says this redemption of hostages is one of the most, perhaps the most important commandment that Jews can fulfill. On the other hand, in the Mishna, in Tractate Gittin, there is a statement that is also brought up in these discussions, which says that captives should not be redeemed for more than their fair worth. And then it has this curious statement, which says it's for the sake of tikkun olam, for betterment of the world. And that's kind of curious, isn't it? That tikkun olam, now we think of this kind of social justice imperative that Jews, especially on the left wing of Judaism, see as very central to Jewish being. But it says in order to make the world better, we should not pay more than a hostage is worth.
I want to hold that thought for just 1 minute and just kind of jump back to some of the things you said. So you said in the Torah, which of course was written before the turn of the millennia, meaning before the Common Era, well before, hundreds of years before, there's no real mention about redeeming the hostages. And then you discussed the Rambam, who lived in the medieval period. And then you went back to the Mishnah, which was about, 600, I think, CE. Is that about right, when it was redacted, plus minus?
Yeah, but these discussions are earlier. I mean, some are, even before the Common Era, but let's say 200s, 300s.
Okay, great. And so essentially what you're saying is that there's a long narrative line of discussing this issue. And what you just brought up right now is one of the things that preoccupies me personally the most when we're discussing this issue of hostage release negotiations, because essentially, bottom line, it is putting a value on a person's life because it is a tit for tat, correct? I mean, in the previous iteration of any kind of ceasefire deal we had, it was something like 50 Palestinian security prisoners for each soldier and 30 Palestinian security prisoners for each civilian, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Lazar?
I mean, it changes, but yeah, one iteration it was that, but these in the current discussions, it continues to change because it's balanced against other things that Israel would give Hamas.
But obviously, the Jewish tradition had a great awareness of this issue of putting a value on a person's life. And we will eventually, once we fast forward through history, we'll get to the Shalit deal, which, of course, was, I believe, 1,027 security prisoners for one person's life. And that was, of course, the apex of any kind of tit for tat in terms of this Palestinian security release versus our Israeli being released. But let's move a little bit forward to the state of Israel. So we've established that there's a deep Jewish tradition in discussing this issue of the hostage negotiations. And when Israel was founded in 1948, this was not a foreign concept as well, because obviously even prior to the declaration of the state, there were issues like this. But it kind of came to a head in the 1950s, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and just to tie the halachic discussion into the state of Israel, people were aware of this discussion. And then as in the 50s or even now, you would have to ask, should Israeli decision-making have any grounding in Jewish sources? And you could also look at it the other way. Does halacha have any relevance to the real, to the most difficult and heart-wrenching dilemmas that the Jewish state finds itself in today? And I think those are important questions, and there's no easy answer to them at all. And then you can also ask, if they're talking about the worth of a hostage, that seems to be monetary, does it also apply to cases when you are talking about releasing not money, but hardened terrorists and endangering future life? So all these are questions that they will have to deal with. But I think the first really interesting hostage or captive release case in Israel is 1954. So we're after the War of Independence. Syria sits on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. It controls the Golan Heights. And there's this poorly planned operation of 6 soldiers, Operation Zarzar, it was called, 2 from Golani, 3 from the paratroopers, who go into the Syrian Golan Heights. And their mission is to wiretap into a phone line, and they get captured. And very interestingly, the defense minister, Pinchas Lavon, tells the chief of staff, Moshe Dayan, a name we all know, that he is authorized to bring down a Syrian military plane, force it to land in Israel if it crosses into Israeli airspace, in order to have a card with which, assets with which to trade, prisoners for prisoners. And Dayan takes it a step further. And December 12th, 1954, the IDF, the Israeli Air Force, they don't shoot it down, but they force down a civilian plane to Ben Gurion Airport with 12 people aboard. And they say, okay, now we have hostages. We can swap for hostages. The Prime Minister, Moshe Sharett at the time, says, no, we're not doing that. We're not pirates. And they actually release them. And interestingly, there's the beginning of this family dynamic where Fegi, who was the mother of one of the soldiers, Ori Ilan, I'll talk about him in a second, she was a member of the left-wing Mapam party, and international organizations actually suggested that she would probably be able to get her own son out if she leads a campaign. And she says, okay, but only if the release will be for everybody and not just my son, right? It's got to be everybody that gets released together. Now, it was a squad of 5 people. The 4 other members were released in 1956, exchanged for 41 Syrian prisoners. So we already see in imbalance. Ori himself became a hero because he was, tortured, expecting to continue to be tortured to release classified information, and he hanged himself in the prison cell, left a note that Lo Bagati, I did not betray my country, and he became really a hero of the young Jewish state for his willingness to sacrifice his life instead of giving up secrets. So there is a very prominent and early case, but again, we should note that this is soldiers and not civilians.
And I think the other thing to emphasize from what you just said is that the mother, Fegi, said it's all or no one, which is really, poignant.
A child.
A soldier.
A farmer.
A grandparent.
In our Those We Have Lost project, The Times of Israel tells the stories of individuals slain in Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th, 2023, with 1,100 individual entries covering almost every single person killed by Hamas. Our Those We Have Lost project paints a picture of each of their lives and the ongoing ripple effects of their deaths. The Those We Have Lost project works to ensure that despite the massive scale of the loss, no one is forgotten.
A teacher.
A musician.
A tourist.
A peacenik.
A farmer.
A grandparent.
A soldier.
Visit the project's homepage on the Times of Israel. Together, we keep their memories alive.
A best friend.
A medic.
A twin.
A family.
So if we move forward, the next, and there's the 56 war, where, of course, we move very quickly through the Sinai Peninsula, capture 5,500 Egyptians, and I think they had 4 Israeli soldiers. And we made that swap, but that's not one of these imbalanced swaps that we talk about today, because prisoners of war for prisoners of war, international law dictates that at the end of wars, you release everybody. It doesn't matter. You don't do one for one. It's just everyone you're holding so that they don't go back to war against you, you swap, and that's much easier. Also, you're dealing with a state, not a terrorist organization. There was another curious civilian one in 1963. The Syrians had taken a number of Israeli civilians. There was a group of 3 that were in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. They were blown to the Syrian bank, and they were taken prisoner. A few others, and Israel had 18 Syrian civilians that they captured in different ways, and that exchange was made as well. So you do see a willingness in Israel's early days to actually hold enemy civilians and have this very tough policy. And it's basically an even trade, 11 for 18. That's pretty even. The 1967 war, again, a very lopsided war. A lightning Israeli campaign on the ground through the Sinai, through the Golan, through the West Bank, through East Jerusalem. We ended up with almost 7,000 Arab soldiers. They only had 15 of ours. We made the swap with Syria, with Jordan, with Egypt, even with Iraq. And that, again, lopsided, but it's much easier. I will note we were not able to get the body of the spy Eli Cohen back from Syria in that, though we did try to. Now, this all changes, though, and we're moving away from the POW for a second, when Palestinian terrorists decide that they are going to use plane hijacking as a way to free prisoners, to get stuff out of Israel, to embarrass Israel, and also to raise their own profile in the world. So you have 1968, the only successful hijacking of an El Al plane. This is not the PLO, this is the PFLP, which is a Marxist organization headed by a Christian, George Habash. And they hijack an Israeli El Al plane. It was forced to land in Algiers, in Algeria. And Israel, and through mediators, talks to the Algerian government. And after several weeks, they agree to hand over 16 convicted terrorists in exchange for 12 Jewish hostages. And they don't say it's one for one. It's not a hostage release. It's a release in gratitude for Algeria's willingness to release the hostages, the civilians. But I would say that here you have a precedent that if you take Israeli civilians, then Israel will be willing to release terrorists. And this is, again, not captured by an Arab government, but by a terrorist organization, the PFLP. I'll note an incident in the 1970s during the War of Attrition. The IDF abducted 5 Syrian officers in exchange. The reason they did that was to exchange for 3 Israeli pilots. So you see this, again, this willingness to capture enemy forces for exchange. Of course, in the 1973 war, there was mass numbers of Israeli hostages, but soldiers, POWs, almost 299 Israeli soldiers were ultimately exchanged for over 8,000 Arab prisoners, some Syrians, some Moroccans, some Iraqis. But again, the POW exchange is much easier. What happens in 1976? A very famous incident, an incident that I think is really set the way we think about the possibility of how to react to a hostage deal, the Entebbe raid, or the Entebbe incident, where terrorists take an Air France airliner, they bring it down in Uganda. And then, of course, we know that a decision is made to send Sayeret Matkal, led by Yoni Netanyahu, who's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's famous older brother. And they conduct a very successful raid. They kill Ugandan soldiers. Yoni Netanyahu is the only soldier that dies. 3 hostages are killed, but ultimately they release almost 100 Israeli hostages and also the Air France staff that was willing to stay, to their great credit, with the Israeli civilian hostages. But I want to make an interesting point there. Everyone's heard about that raid. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who gave the order for that raid, was actually, as the raid was being planned and moving forward, he was still considering and moving forward on meeting the hostage takers' demands. We know that now from released protocols and released records, but he even, had a list of 53 terrorists that the hostage takers wanted to release. He had that list. He was examining it. So really, it was down to the last minute where he made this decision of, we're actually going to not meet their demands. We're going to go in at full force. And some people say that Israel kind of had this Rabin doctrine that was created, where if Israel can try to release and rescue hostages by military force, they'll do that. If not, then we'll talk.
That's really interesting, Lazar, to think about how in this specific, very famous operation, the Entebbe operation, that both avenues were being pursued at the same time. And I'm also just marking that in my brain to compare to what's happening right now, of course. I'll just anecdotally say I was at the Entebbe airport about 2 years ago, and there is nothing to remind you of this operation because there's a new Entebbe airport, and there's not even a plaque when I was there to remind visitors about this.
Does not surprise me. I'm sure it wasn't something that Uganda wants to remember. There's a release in 1979, one captured soldier from the 1978 Operation Litani, in which the IDF moves into southern Lebanon to push back PLO terrorists. He is released in 1979 for 76 terrorists. Okay, again, this is a soldier, it's not civilian, but here we see that Israel is willing to start doing these very, very lopsided exchanges. At the same time, in the 70s, it's the time of the very high-profile Palestinian raids on northern Israel. There's the 1978, the Coastal Road Massacre, where terrorists come into Magan Michael Beach, they take a bus. And these type of incidents are generally dealt with by military force. You kill the terrorists, a lot of times many of the hostages get killed, but if there's a possibility of using Sayeret Matkal or some other elite force to deal with it, that's what's done in the 70s. When does this change? I think it's really after the first Lebanon War, where 8 soldiers were captured by terrorists, by PLO or Fatah terrorists, part of the PLO, from a lookout post in southern Lebanon. 2 of the soldiers are given to terrorists from Ahmed Jibril's offshoot PFLP-GC, and Fatah holds the other 6. Now, it was easier or quicker to release the 6 that were held by Fatah. That happens already in 1983. But listen to this. For the 6 soldiers, 4,700 terrorists and prisoners are released.
Wait, say it again.
4,700.
Wow, for 6 soldiers. 6
soldiers. 3,400 are set free in Lebanon. Now, a lot of those can serve as the core of either PLO or if they're from the other factions of other groups that are fighting against Israel. 1,100 are sent to Algeria. Interestingly, Israel also gives back the PLO archives as part of that as well. But that wasn't the main thing here. And people at the time talk about why did they do that? You have Yitzhak Shamir, the prime minister, who says, he acknowledges we paid a high price, but we were faced by the fact that their lives were in peril. So the fact that, they could have been killed made Israel willing to do that release. Now, the other two soldiers, so there was 8, 6 were given back, were held by Ahmed Jibril's organization. It became clear that he was also holding a third soldier. And this became known as the 1985 Jibril affair, the Jibril release. Now, one of the soldiers was named Yosef Grof. His mother, Miriam Grof, who had no background in political organizing or anything, I think she's really the forerunner of what we've seen in the Shalit affair that we see today, where she very effectively grasped her ability to put public pressure on the government. She made demands. It wasn't requests. She made demands of the government, and she really focused on what's important to her. She didn't talk about what's good for the country. She made her case based on what she needs, what her family needs. There's actually a former senior member of the IDF. I think this was quoted by Ronan Bergman in the New York Times. This senior IDF officer said that he remembered that Miriam Grof had said, "The country can go up in smoke. I just want my son to go home." So it's a different type of effective organizing and pressure put on by the families.
And just speaking as a mother, I can surely understand where she's coming from, as definitely anyone who has a child can definitely understand that perspective. And that's why it's up to the leadership of the country to make the fateful decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it should be, but you certainly see, again, around Shalit in 2011, also today, the politicians pay attention to the families. Certainly the media pays attention to the families. They are an important, sometimes even I would say decisive element in all of this. And in this 1985 deal, new red lines were crossed in that Israel released a lot of prisoners with blood on their hands. They let the other side just, point out and demand specific prisoners. And there was basically this recognition afterward that this release in the Jibril affair, so it's smaller than the previous one. It's 1,150 terrorists, but this is 1985. Israel recognizes that without this, the backbone of the first Intifada, which changed, the trajectory of Israel and the Palestinians, could not have happened. Interestingly, the IDF chief of staff, Moshe Levy, at the time, actually considered putting the returned soldiers on court-martial for succumbing to capture so easily and not putting up a fight. Obviously, after all this, there was a lot of reasons not to, and he backed off from that. But that was an interesting part of it. I don't think we would ever hear that today. But this was an incident that had a lot of public backlash. There was a lot of detractors at the time, and Yitzhak Rabin was part of this. Shimon Peres was the prime minister at the time. They acknowledged the price was heavy, but they said, we have a responsibility for each and every person. But it was seen as a watershed, and that's something that set the country on a new path.
For the most part, for most of our discussion, we've been talking about soldiers who have been taken hostage, which is an act of war versus an act of terrorism, perhaps. I don't know how you define it yourself, Lazar, but of course, if you're just we're all keeping in mind the October 7th, the situation and the hostages taken on October 7th in every single thing you're saying, of course. And I wonder where the turning point came where the terrorists decided that taking civilians was definitely a suitable tactic.
It seems to be with the plane hijackings, where these planes were full of civilians. It wasn't like the previous cases or some subsequent cases where Israel would be able to attack the hostage takers on Israeli territories. It was really seen as much more comfortable and a much bigger problem for Israel. Of course, it's very hard to do. But I think they went after who was available. If they were able to get soldiers, that was a very, very valuable asset. And they continue to try to get soldiers. That is even seen as more valuable, right? Because you have the subsequent famous cases. You have in 2000, after Israel pulls out of Lebanon, there is an attack by Hezbollah on the border. Three combat engineers are killed, and their bodies are taken captive. How does Israel get them back? In 2004, they get the three bodies back. But who is the headline of that episode? Elchanan Tenenbaum, who was a reservist colonel. He had been captured because he was in financial problems. He had a friend who lured him to Dubai to do a drug deal, to smuggle a lot of drugs into Israel, and he was captured there. Ultimately, he was released in this deal. You had 401 prisoners released, including two senior Hezbollah members who were captured by Israel in order to get Ron Arad back. So we're doing this massive release, including of terrorists, for three bodies and one criminal. We want to talk about lopsided. That shows, where the trend is going in 2004. And I think the German mediators, that's who we used to mediate, were shocked at the time. One of the mediators said, "You Israelis have a very unusual attitude toward this matter, toward the bodies, the price you're willing to pay."
If you remember, I don't know if you were here yet, Lazar, in 2004, but if you remember, Tenenbaum's family was very instrumental, and they also created this high-profile media campaign to get their father back. And simple Israelis, such as me, we had no idea, of course, that the father was this hardened criminal in the end. So it was a very huge media storm over it.
And I'll just add a postscript. When former Mossad chief Meir Dagan was campaigning against the Gilad Shalit deal, which was in 2011, he said that 231 Israelis were killed by the terrorists released in the Tenenbaum deal. So again, for one criminal and three bodies, he's making the equation that's 231 dead Israelis.
And of course, let's skip ahead to the Gilad Shalit deal at this point. And of course, the biggest accusation from those who don't want to see these high price deals go forward is the very fact that so many of those who are let free in this Gilad Shalit deal, and obviously Gilad Shalit had nothing to do with this deal, right? He was innocent from everything here. But all of these hardened criminals who were set free, so many of them, including, of course, Sinwar, were participants in subsequent terror attacks, most memorably, of course, October 7th.
Yeah, so Gilad Shalit was an active duty tank soldier. There was an attack. He was on the Israeli side of the Gaza border. This is after the pullout. This is in 2006. It was a squad of 8 terrorists, some from Hamas, some from other organizations, tunneled under the fence. Then they split into 3 different groups. And one of the groups attacked his tank with an anti-tank RPG. He gave himself up, basically, surrendered himself without much of a fight. And he was the only one other people died in the attack, but he was the only hostage taken. He spent 5 years in Hamas captivity. In order to get a sign of life, during the negotiations, Israel gave up prisoners. And ultimately, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made the decision to give up 1,027 terrorists, including Yihye Sinwar, like you said. And this is the same Netanyahu who, in his 1986 book on terrorism, said the only way to deal with this is to let terrorists know that the only deal we're willing to make is you give up the terrorists and you don't die. But any sort of deals, it only encourages more terrorism. They have to know that we're going to come save them. Obviously, you see, as prime minister, he acts very differently. But I think I'm confident in saying, without the Gilad Shalit deal, you don't have Sinwar out, you don't have other hardened terrorists out. And if you didn't have previous deals, you wouldn't have people like Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas, out. Then we don't have October 7th, and we don't have the 251 hostages and the over 1,200 dead. And it seems there could very well be more as the fighting continues. So we see the price of it. People can argue, whether because there was a specific individual being held and that is worth more than theoretical people in the future. And there's other failures that led to October 7th. It wasn't determinative. It wasn't just because Yachye Sinwar was out, we automatically are going to have more hostages and more killed. We could have made decisions that kept that from happening. Seriously persuasive cases can be made for both sides. But I think we have to point at the fact that this made the potential or the possibility of October 7th much more likely.
I want to return to one of the sources that I already have emphasized, and I believe it is the Mishna Gitin, in which you said, you should quote it because I'll get it wrong, but something along the lines that don't give away a person for more than his value or something like that. Do you have that quote in front of you again?
Yeah, captives are not to be redeemed for more than their worth for the sake of tikkun olam.
Right. And it's a very, very heart-rending thing to be talking about here, of course. And of course, there are two different categories. There's the soldier category, and you yourself are a reservist officer. And then there's, of course, the civilian category. So soldiers, when they take the oath, at least fighters, I'm not sure if it's for all soldiers because I only have fighters, they take an oath that they say, if I need to forfeit my life, so be it. Something along these lines. Maybe you can quote it out a little more precisely. But a civilian doesn't ever say that, meaning even if he was at one point a soldier, the civilian who is taken captive is not agreeing to this contract of giving up his life, of sacrificing himself. Do you have thoughts on this conundrum, on these two different categories?
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. It doesn't matter if a soldier is what we call a lochem, combat soldier, or anything else. The minute you put on uniform, it's a real statement. First of all, you're a legal target in a war. So the Syrian military doesn't really exist much anymore, but they could legally target you in war and it would not be a crime of any sort. They couldn't be prosecuted for it. And it means that you are putting yourself in a situation where you are meant to die to protect civilians. That's when things work properly. It could be you're going to die on the battlefield, charging at the enemy, but it could be in a number of other ways as well. Absolutely. Civilians have not made that contract, or once they take off their uniform, they're not part of that contract anymore. So I think, that should be part of the discussion as well. When we talk about, in the past cases, 3 is IDF soldiers, let's bring them back. Once they're if they're still living, that's certainly a persuasive case. But other people have made the case, okay, if these 3 soldiers, we're willing to send them sometimes to charge into enemy machine gun fire, and we're willing to do that for some much smaller gains, maybe just to gain a small hill or to gain a few minutes for another force to move safely through an area, than releasing thousands of terrorists. So the strategic or the logical argument is definitely there to be made. But I think it's important to note that we should not treat soldiers, even though they're drafted by law, the way we do civilians. Those are 2 separate categories. I will say, that we've just come out of Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron. There's this fusion of the two, right? Because we're talking about soldiers who know that they're willing to give up their lives for the country. They're heroes, with victims who are civilians who could have been on a bus just going about their day, who are killed. They kind of get put together in one category, and we can talk about whether that's appropriate. But in the Israeli mind, it seems to be putting these 2 unlike categories together.
That is a very good point. And the official name in English, at least, is Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers and Victims of Terror. So it is, as you said, it's one bucket that we put everyone into when we're mourning the losses on Memorial Day, which was this week, as you said. And it does show a remarkable insight into the Israeli psyche. And one other element that I think is difficult for perhaps our listeners in North America to internalize is that the officers, the soldiers, all of the IDF, they are our sons as well, meaning our sons and our daughters. I have a fighting daughter myself, but they are our children. They are our brothers. They are our fathers. They are our husbands and wives, obviously, too. They are us. And there is no they, and there is no us anymore in terms of the IDF, except for, of course, the very painful subject of the ultra-Orthodox lack of conscription. But what I'm saying is perhaps it is inevitable that it would be intertwined in the Israeli public when the hostage protests are taking place, meaning the families of the hostages, soldiers or civilians alike, are coming together and saying, bring them home now. So do you think it is even possible to separate them out in any kind of future deal? I mean, God forbid, but...
Well, we already did separate them out somewhat but that's basically a kind of Hamas demands. We had the quote-unquote humanitarian category at the beginning of this January deal that came about, just before Trump came into office. We had the it was like 6 weeks, but there was a number of intermediate, something like 8-9 hostage releases. And that started with the children and the women and then elderly and sick men. And now you're left with the male soldiers and men who are fighting age and therefore are considered soldiers by Hamas, which of course is reprehensible. But so there already has been some sort of separation. Again, it's a problem in Israeli society, like you said, since most of the mainstream of Israeli society, without the Haredim, without the Arab sector, do serve, then there's kind of this. It's not a militarization of Israeli society. It's kind of a civilianization of the army. I'm not happy with it. I think it leads to discipline problems and other issues as well. But that is certainly part of it. That it's not a professional army that's getting well paid, that's fighting far away. It's people who this is part of Israeliness, and families have all their kids go, and even the parents going to fight. It's hard to make that separation, though. I think it's important to do so because, what we're asking of a soldier on the battlefield is very different than what we're asking of a civilian. And I think it's important to emphasize that, and it should remain that way.
Okay, you and I have not solved this issue, obviously, but we've raised a lot of important questions. And I do hope, I pray, in fact, that our leadership is taking all of this into account when they're discussing all of the different issues going into these hostage talks. And Lazar, do you think, you personally, as somebody who has been covering these negotiations since, of course, October 7th, 2023, do you think that the leadership right now is taking all of this into consideration at this point?
So there's different elements of the leadership. President Isaac Herzog, who I interviewed in the recent days, and you can read my interview with him on the Times of Israel site. I think he's done a really masterful job of remaining relevant in the discussion, keeping the hostage families and the reality of the hostages on the minds of the Israeli public, but also internationally, staying above the political fray, and really, but actually saying something of value. He doesn't say exactly how it should be done, but he says no stone should be left unturned in our attempts to bring back the hostages. But I asked him, isn't there sometimes a price that is too high to be paid? And he said, yeah, that's a valid statement. I don't discount that. That has to be part of the discussion. But at the same time, there are other ways to get out hostages, and we have to do everything possible. So that's on the one hand. In terms of the political leadership, I have criticisms of the political leadership, which is the Netanyahu government, over the way it's conducted the battlefield war in Gaza. I think they've been much more successful in the north. It's harder for me to be critical of the way they've done the hostage negotiations because we have to be honest. It's been quite successful, right? So you're talking about 251, and we only have, it's not only, but in numbers of what the expectations could have been when being held by a group like Hamas, there's only 59 still there, up to 24, thank you, Sarah Netanyahu, that are still alive. That's successful, and we have not given up our international legitimacy to conduct the war, and we're still conducting the war in Gaza. So that's, at times they've made stumbles, and maybe they could have done better at times, but I think they have done well. It could be that they have been pushed to be more attentive to the hostage issue, and I think that was especially true at the beginning because of the public pressure and because of the hostage families in that campaign. Again, it becomes harder and harder the closer we get because Hamas really doesn't have any, sorry to say this, but assets. To them, these human beings are just assets to ensure their own survival. They don't have any assets left besides the hostages. The international community is not going to come rescue them. Hezbollah is not going to come rescue them. The Israeli opposition isn't going to force an end to this war. All they have left, and they can't threaten Israeli civilians really anymore. All they have left is who they're holding, and it's going to be harder and harder to get those free. That's what the negotiators are doing now, team led by Gal Hirsch, who I know is very dedicated to this issue. So hopefully we can talk soon about how we succeeded in getting them free. But for now, these issues, both in Jewish sources, in the Talmud, in Maimonides, and also in Israeli history, remain very salient. They point us in a number of different directions, and there really are no easy answers.
Lazar, I thank you so much for this conversation. It means a lot to me to hear all of this backstory and history, and I know it does to our listenership as well. So thank you very much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another episode next week. This installment was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.